And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hello, I'm meteorologist David Kramer with Alaska Weather. Thanks for joining us for the marine section of the forecast for September 8th. Starting off, quick look at our ice edge. Near the coastline, all clear waters, just some scattered areas of ice up farther to the north, nothing near the coastline. Taking a look now at a recap of weather focused on the marine areas before we jump into the marine forecast. We have a low out over the Bering Sea that's going to bring some stronger winds to areas throughout the Bering Sea and near the Aleutian Islands for tonight. We have another low out over the Gulf of Alaska, bringing in some stronger winds to areas of the Panhandle. As we look into Saturday, a lot of rain down there as well, starting to weaken as we get farther in the day on Saturday with some of the winds down there. From widespread rain throughout mainland Alaska up into the Brooks Range as well. Our other system will have dipped south of the Alaska Peninsula, coming in from the Pribilof Islands in that southeasterly trajectory. It's going to start to bring some southerly winds to areas around Kodiak Island and the Alaska Peninsula. And then on the backside of this, though, we're going to see northerly winds out by the central and eastern Aleutians. Finally, on Sunday, quite a bit weaker flow pattern throughout much of the state, including the Gulf of Alaska, all along the west coast as well. We're going to see some widespread rain throughout much of the state, from the Arctic coastline down through the interior and west coast into south central, also out over the Bering Sea and Aleutians. We're going to see more rain and some lighter winds out for the Panhandle as well as we move into Sunday. So taking a look now a little bit more detailed in, we can see some of the stronger winds out over the Gulf waters here on Saturday for southeast Alaska, getting up to as high as 35 knots, the strongest as we get farther to the north. Seas up to as high as 15 to 17 feet in the eastern Gulf, up near 20 to 21 feet as we get into the northern Gulf. In the inside waters, light for most areas. However, some of the channeled areas by Petersburg are going to see some stronger winds up to as high as 40 knots out of a southeasterly direction on Saturday. On Sunday, as we saw in the surface maps, diminishing in terms of winds for much of southeast, and the inside waters 10 to 15 knots out of a southeasterly direction, 25 knots in the Gulf waters out of that southeast direction as well. As we look out over south central Alaska here on Saturday, some of the strongest winds are in the northern portions of the Gulf up to as high as 35 knots out of the southeast, 30 knots in Prince William Sound area, dropping down to around 20 knots as we get closer towards the Kenai Peninsula and Barren Islands, and the direction is going to shift quite a bit to be more westerly in those areas. In the Cook Inlet area, westerly direction as well, 10 to 15 knots expected. On Sunday in the Cook Inlet area, northeasterly direction, 15 to 20 knots expected. Around the Barren Islands, more easterly direction to the winds, 20 to 25 knots. Out over the northern portions of the Gulf, for the most part, 15 to 20, a little bit stronger as we get farther to the east, 25 knots expected there. And lighter winds, 10 knots out of the northeast for Prince William Sound. As we look at Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island areas, lighter winds out of a southerly direction for Kodiak, 15 knots there. A little bit stronger as we get by the Alaska Peninsula, around 25 knots on both sides of the peninsula out of a southeasterly direction. As we move into Sunday, flow switching as we have a low southeast of Kodiak Island. Going to see a lot of northwesterly winds around the peninsula, 15 to 20 knots there. Picking up as we get closer towards Kodiak Island, up to as high as 30 knots out of a more north to northeasterly direction. Seas getting up to as high as 12 feet on the southeast side of Kodiak. As we look at the Aleutian Islands on Saturday, westerly winds 25 to 30 knots for the central and eastern Aleutians, and then 20 to 25 knots by the western Aleutians, but still out of that westerly direction. Then on Sunday, continuing to see westerly flow out by the western Aleutians, 15 to 20 knots expected there. Weaker for the central Aleutians, only around 10 to 15 knots out of the west, and then 15 to 20 knots out of the west for the eastern Aleutians. Along the west coast of the state, primarily a easterly component, some northeasterly winds as we get a little bit farther to the north, 10 to 15 knots north of Nunavik Island. South of Nunavik Island, easterly winds 20 knots, and as we get out into the Bering, things picking up, 30 knots out of the east for St. Matthew Island as well as by the Pribilof Islands. Then on Sunday, light winds along the coastline out of a westerly component around 10 knots there. Southerly winds out by St. Matthew Island and the Pribilof Islands up to as high as 15 knots. All along the Arctic coastline, we're going to see easterly winds on Saturday, 20 to 25 for eastern locations, 15 to 20 as we get farther to the west. Northeast winds down the west coast, fairly light 10 to 15 knots are expected. Then on Sunday, continued light winds for the west coast, only around 10 knots. But as we get along the Arctic coastline, picking up and becoming easterly, 20 to 25 knots, strongest as we get farther to the east. For Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer. Thanks for joining us.